many years, New Zealand has shut itself off from the big advances being made in the scientific world.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time in New Zealand for green projects.
It's not just this government, as I say, previous governments have not tackled this issue. It's been a long-running, I think, problem.
While ensuring the financial security of Qantas, he essentially trashed the brand. So it's an interesting question as to whether you can do both.
We are a leader in terms of agriculture.
Welcome to the Weekly Wrap, where we go over the top video stories from the past week. First up, the government has announced changes to New Zealand's GE-free legislation. Take a look.
Today, we are really pleased to announce that, as promised, the government will end the effective ban on gene technology in New Zealand. And from the end of 2025, research and trials of gene technologies and products, including medicines and vaccines based on gene technologies, will become available in New Zealand. New legislation and a dedicated new regulator will oversee gene technology to ensure it is used safely. This change will bring enormous opportunities and benefits for New Zealand in climate change, in health, and in our exports and productivity. We're here today at Plant and Food Research, where gene technology, as you've seen, is being used in lab research to reduce flowering times and to increase plant production. But under the current rules, as you've heard, these trials have to stay in the lab because gene technology is regulated by legislation that was passed in 1996. And it's a law for a bygone era, and as since then, gene editing and other techniques have advanced enormously.
Gene technologies have been used in New Zealand since the 1970s, but restrictive rules and time-consuming processes have made research outside the lab almost impossible. Many of our trading partners, including Australia, the EU, England, have all moved to adapt their legislation to reflect advances in gene technology over the past few years, and in particular, the widespread use of precision gene editing. New Zealand needs to keep up, and we will be able to do this with a new regime.
The advent of these new technologies such as gene editing is a step change that we believe has great potential for speeding up how we produce the sustainable, healthy foods that New Zealand's overseas markets are demanding. The speed is something our scientists are keen to harness, as there are big challenges that we need to address. We cannot deny the impact of climate change and how we produce food with volatile, unpredictable weather patterns like Cyclone Gabrielle and the new pests and disease incursions becoming more likely. We need to be able to use as many tools as possible to ensure our agri-food sector remains competitive on the global market despite these challenges. Many of our export markets have already changed their regulations, and our competitors are using these technologies to produce new products. Bringing our regulations in line will ensure New Zealand can compete on a level playing field.
But what I'd say to you is, as you've just heard some of the examples, there is huge opportunity for New Zealand. You've just seen some horticultural examples. Think about the issues around climate change that we're dealing with respect to agricultural emissions. Think about the health benefits that we're actually discovering, as Judith has talked about as well. So, the reality is we've got to get into the 21st century. New Zealand can maintain its position around the world, but importantly, we are not going to get left behind from the developed world. And we've got great scientists that can make these advancements, and we can commercialise their technology.
Trade Minister Todd McClay went to India last week as the government continues its efforts to strengthen trade ties with the rising economic power. Our political editor Brent Edwards caught up with the minister before he left.
So what's on the agenda this time?
Yeah, look, it's another visit. In fact, I think this will be my fifth meeting in person with Minister Goyal, the Commerce and Trade Minister of India, my counterpart, and it will be my third visit in about 6 months. There's big opportunities in India for New Zealand. You know that we're ambition to strengthen and deepen the relationship. We're ambitious to have a bit of trade architecture, a trade agreement with them, but we're also looking for ways to increase two-way trade between our countries, and it's a commitment Minister Goyal and I have made together, and so very pleased to get up there. It's very much an agriculture, forestry and trade visit. Be meeting with agricultural ministers and companies, both New Zealand and India, that are involved in food production, dairy, forestry, other things like that, and just a chance to continue to build those contacts and those relationships and what is and in the future will be a very important part of the New Zealand economy.
And I presume building that trade and those networks is an important part of getting to a position at some point where then formal trade negotiation could start.
It certainly is. I mean, there are countries of the world that we've just negotiated with because we've wanted to, but it was clear to us when we came to government that the relationship with India had been underdone over a period of time, and we were very clear that we want that relationship to be a strategic priority for New Zealand. Now, in much of what New Zealand do, it is about trade, but by the way, that's what much of the world does as well. I suppose the difference with India now compared to when I was Trade Minister 6 or 7 years ago is that they are starting to do deals with countries of the world, and they're starting to negotiate. So they have an FTA with Australia. They're negotiating more or less with the EU, with the UK. They were with Canada. There are a number of countries of the world that they're either looking to negotiate or they've concluded with, and therefore New Zealand needs to be part of that. But the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, has been clear. We also want to invest in that relationship because it's an important one for us. And so my visit as Agriculture, Forestry and Trade Minister is just another, step in that direction.
I mean, look, it's all very well you going up there a lot, and that's great, but what are New Zealand businesses doing? Are they doing enough?
They are. They have a presence in the market. We don't have a huge amount of trade with India, about $2 billion from memory, two-way trade. Compared to its relative size of 1.4 billion people, it's about the same amount of two-way trade as we have with the UAE, which is a much smaller population. So there's huge opportunity there. Probably some of the reason our trade is not as great as it could be is that India is a very protected market. They have very, very high tariff rates. So why do we not sell very much wine, New Zealand wine, into India? It's a 150% tariff rate at the border. The Australians, I think from memory, their tariff rate has dropped to about 75% for their wine. We sell very little lamb into that market, although it's very high quality lamb, and they consume a lot of lamb. There's a 30% tariff on our lamb going in there. Australia, by comparison, has a 0% tariff rate under their trade agreement. But New Zealand companies are active. They're showing a lot of interest. They engage with the market, both in sending IT services and so on there. And the Dairy Processors Association has just been up there for formal meetings and conversations with their counterparts, which is very, very constructive. And so we'll be finding ways to increase that level of contact, business to business, people to people. That's part of growing the relationship. It's not just about trade, although trade's a very important part of the reason we want to do this.
I suppose on the dairy side it is about building those relationships, and I guess that fear that India has for its dairy farmers if it had a deal with New Zealand that included dairy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm yet to be involved in a trade negotiation or observe one between New Zealand and another country where dairy isn't an issue and isn't a challenge. It always is. But, the processors are looking to talk is a very, very good idea. Part of my visit next week will be to talk about ways we can cooperate in the dairy space around production. New Zealand farmers produce more milk solid per level of input than probably anywhere in the world, and so there'll be a lot that we can do with them in cooperation to help them grow their dairy sector and show that the relationship is not just about selling things, it's about investing, it's about technology, it's about buying from them as well, and ways that we can help them produce more and be more efficient. The most interesting thing about India is they're not that far away, forecasts tell us, of never producing enough dairy for their own level of consumption. And so whether we get a perfect deal on day one or we have to wait some years as we did with China, it took more than 20 years to get the level of liberalisation in dairy that we would want. What we do know is when they need to start looking to buy from the world, they'll buy from their friends, they'll buy from their strategic partners, and they'll buy from the countries that they have trade deals with. And that's the very reason we need a high-quality trade deal with them, as well as, strengthening the relationship in many other areas.
The full interview is linked below. This week, NBR released our deep dive into the building supplies sector. Here's a look at how new sustainable building options are being implemented.
We've got a research project running at the moment which we're just about to finalise, which is to basically develop some design guidance relating to low-rise buildings for steel and steel hybrid design. And what that research is showing is that with clever design, we can already meet our emission target reductions, and so you choose your material based on what is the optimal performance of that material, and then the design reductions can cumulatively reach up to 50% compared to a reference building. So embodied carbon is basically all of the carbon in a building from the materials being constructed through construction and erection, maintenance and end of life. So what we need to do is go beyond end of life and look at a circular economy for our building materials, and that will definitely have an improvement in terms of our carbon performance, as well as extending the life of those buildings. So essentially, if you think of reuse of building materials in situ, what you're wanting to do is maintain the core, the backbone of the building, and then switch out modules for adaptive reuse in the future. So for example, for residential construction, you might be repurposing an old commercial building similar to CAB in Auckland, and what you want to be able to do is reuse the materials as much as you can in situ at that location, and that has obvious benefits in terms of carbon because we're not extracting any additional resources, so there's additional sustainability benefits, but also we're not having to reconstruct those materials from the manufacturing end, and so all of that carbon is then reduced.
It's a really exciting time in New Zealand for green projects, particularly this project. We've targeted a number of initiatives around energy efficiency, targeting a 5-star neighbours outcome, so that gets verified post-completion. We've also targeted a 6-star Green Star Design and As-Built rating under the Wynyard volume program, which other projects in the area that we've contributed to have pursued. And that rating will be achieved post-completion. The innovative aspects of the project are in the embodied carbon calculation, measurement and improvement. So we're really proud to have worked quite closely with our head contractor Hawkins to really get into the nitty-gritty around some of those elements of the project that have contributed the largest component to embodied carbon, and that's in our steel and also our use of cross-laminated timber across the project. The Green Building Council in New Zealand is basically doing a lift and shift from the Australian Green Building Council's new Green Star program, and with some slight modifications to suit the New Zealand market. So, for example, the steel industry is responding domestically through adopting what our Australian counterparts have developed for the Australian Green Building Council's program. In the past 5 years, the Design and As-Built program under Green Star through the New Zealand Green Building Council has been the norm for industry here around development, and more recently in the Australian market in particular, about 2 years ago they adopted a new standard which was looking more at adapting to climate change, adapting to net zero targets, adapting to embodied carbon targets, and making some of those key material issues a bit more prevalent in the way that we're building, and being able to really confirm that the sustainability targets within the Green Star program are world leading. And so that transition is taking place in New Zealand at the moment, where the Australian program has been adapted here and will be rolled out this year. So we're really excited to take some of the innovative elements of this project and other projects that we're working on and really drive home the new framework for our future developments as they adapt to the new frameworks that come out. That's really important for creating a circular economy. So how can we start to reuse rather than just simply recycle or send our products to landfill? And in order to be able to reuse a product at end of life, you actually need to understand what is it that that product comprises, how it's been used, what kind of environmental factors have affected it, for example, seismic events, and how appropriate it is then at end of life for reuse in situ or moving and being used in another building.
So we're seeing the key benefits around the why for us as being driven by our tenants, our investors, our key stakeholders, our suppliers, all driving home the same message around sustainability being quite a core component of the way that they want to run their businesses and the way that they want to park their capital. So from our perspective, particularly from a commercial benefit, we're also getting the benefit of working quite closely with financial institutions and investors who will lend to us at a lower rate to see a better performing and more sustainable product on their books. And in addition, we've got occupiers that will only consider occupying our space if we hit their checklist around Green Star, around neighbours targets, particularly with government, and then also now the health and wellbeing elements that will meet the intent post-COVID of staff being happy and healthy in their new accommodations.
All of the construction industry is going to need to meet the new requirements, which are going to be more stringent than what they were previously. So for example, 6-star Green Star achievement is going to be more difficult, and I think that's probably the way that it should be, is that those programs are continually challenging us to improve.
The full series of feature articles on building supplies is available on mbr.co.nz. Well, high immigration is continuing to put pressure on infrastructure and services, while at the same time record numbers of New Zealanders leave the country. Here's the analysis.
Brent, what's the problem with immigration flows at the moment?
Well, at the moment, in the year to the end of June, there was a net loss of New Zealanders of 55,000, which is, an extraordinarily high number of more New Zealanders leaving the country, for a long term or permanently than those returning home. But that was offset when you looked at then other migration. So there was a net migration gain when you look at people from other countries coming of 73,300. Down from the sort of record highs that we've been experienced, but still very, very high numbers. And kind of both numbers are worrying. I mean, I think, losing too many New Zealanders, people who've got connections to the country and skills and that, obviously leaving, most of them apparently for good. And then the immigration numbers, in a way, it's not that too many are coming in, but too many are coming in and it's not being matched by investment in housing and services and in infrastructure to deal with that rapidly rising population.
Do you think that the government doesn't like talking about immigration or even population because it's political poison?
Well, look, it's difficult. And this is an issue that successive governments have kind of tinkered with, and we keep on tinkering with the immigration policies and trying to get a focus onto skilled migrants and migrants who have got a lot of money, all that kind of thing. But as far as I can see, there's never been any overall population policy to say, look, how is the country growing? What sort of population growth do we want to see? And if we're seeing those sorts of numbers coming in, what are we doing about it to ensure that we do build enough schools, hospitals, roads, infrastructure, have enough doctors, nurses, teachers, all the services that you'll want to, as well as obviously houses, because if you get big numbers of people coming in but you're not providing the services and the infrastructure to cope with them, then obviously you put real pressure on those services and infrastructure that are already in place.
Seems like a no-brainer, really. I mean, Australia has been even more aggressive than New Zealand in going after these new Australians, but they too have similar problems.
Yeah, well, they do. And I mean, for instance, I think in February, the first month they had a net gain of 100,000, monthly gain. And so they are, I think, considering the same sorts of issues about, they want migrants because they bring a lot to the country. But again, it puts real pressure on services and infrastructure in Australia if you have large numbers of people. And at the moment there, I think it is helping put pressure on housing prices. Here in New Zealand at the moment, following on from COVID and what have you, we've still got a fairly depressed housing market. I mean, house prices still seem to be just easing down a bit, although rents are going up. So renting a house is very difficult, and you suspect probably with another 70,000 people being added to the population in a year, they'll be looking for rental accommodation, if not trying to buy a house. So that would put some pressure on. So, yeah, both countries have similar problems. I guess, kind of ironically in a way, New Zealand is probably contributing to Australia's problem because most of the people, I think, leaving here are going across the ditch.
Yeah. I mean, we have austerity in place. We have an economy that's sort of faltering to some degree. What can the government do apart from have an honest conversation about what's going on?
Well, when it comes to immigration, it does, I think, need to be a sort of more broader, as I say, I think, population policy, and it needs to be geared to governments. And it's not just this government. As I say, previous governments have not tackled this issue. It's been a long-running, I think, problem. Is around saying, we'll tie it to, like, right, if we're going to have this sort of population growth, we're going to be investing this much extra here, here and here so that we can cope, so that those people come in, they can get housing at a decent sort of affordable price, they can go to good schools, they can get access to a GP, including the people who already live here. So you'd be kind of doing all that sort of stuff. But if you look back 20, 30 years or more, and I mean, and this is the same thing in Australia, immigration has helped hold up the economy. And I think, in Australia, if it hadn't been for immigration, it probably would have gone into recession in the last year or two, as we did. But you think what New Zealand's economy would have been like if we hadn't had these people coming in, it would have probably been in much worse shape in terms of the broad numbers. But you can't rely on just pouring more and more people into a country, booming house prices, and so I guess, and spending really based on debt to keep an economy going, which I think is largely what's underpinned the New Zealand economy for a long time. So, governments, or any government, has to look at, well, what can they do to manage immigration, but at the same time create economic activity that's based more on productivity gains and investment than on the sort of model that we've followed over the last 20, 30 years.
Do you think also they have to do a bit of educating of the public as to why immigration is important? I mean, I think sometimes people don't quite understand the contribution immigrants make, which is what you've just talked about.
Yeah, well, there has to be a bit of that because, one of the problems is because governments haven't been investing enough, I think what people have seen has probably been some of the gridlock and pressure put on services and on housing because of a growing population. And there's always a fear, and we've seen politicians kind of stir this a bit, that you blame the immigrant. Well, it's not the immigrant's fault at all. It's just a lack of planning, particularly at a national level, to ensure that people coming in contribute to our economy, which they do. I mean, I think, it's well known, I think immigrants, do make great contribution to any country's economy. But at the same time, you do need to invest in some of those basic services and infrastructure so that you don't put pressure on what you already have because your population grows too big to be able to manage.
To Australian news, and Lachlan Cahoon analyses the complex legacy of former Qantas CEO Alan Joyce.
Lachlan, why don't we start with what the board decided in the first place?
Sure, Hamish. So this was in response to what was a bit of an annus horribilis for the airline last year. There was a class action by customers. The ACCC, the competition watchdog, clamped down on them over the sale of tickets that had actually been cancelled. And also there was a High Court ruling against the airline after they sacked about 1,700 baggage handlers during the COVID crisis and outsourced those jobs. So they paid $120 million in penalties over that, but they still haven't been fined over the High Court ruling. So what happened was the board commissioned a review. McKinsey, the consultants, they got them in to look at management, and they discovered that there was, I quote here, significant reputational and customer service issues that had been caused by management failures over the last few years. And as you say, they stripped Joyce of $9.2 million of his final payout. But when you consider that he was due to get paid about $21 million and had been very handsomely remunerated in the previous years, that's not too much of a penalty. But they did strip him of $9.2 million last week.
So a lot of this stuff has obviously come to the surface in the last few years, but he's been in that top job, or was in that top job for a long time. So, I mean, looking further back, what were some of his achievements in the role?
Well, he joined Qantas in the early 2000s, and from 2003 to 2008, he had a previous history as CEO of Jetstar, which is a Qantas low-budget airline, which has been one of the big success stories that the airline has had domestically and internationally, and that's really helped Qantas sort of establish itself as a premium brand. So that was a major role there. He became CEO of Qantas in 2008, and in that role navigated the global financial crisis, the avian flu, the COVID pandemic. And so while a lot of other airlines have struggled and failed, gone broke, Qantas has thrived, and you'd have to give Alan Joyce credit for that. And you'd have to say that financially, at least, Qantas is in a much better place now than it was when he joined the airline.
Why was he so controversial then in recent years?
Well, so he, while ensuring the financial security of Qantas, he essentially trashed the brand. So it's an interesting question as to whether you can do both. He changed many of the traditional work practices at Qantas. I mean, Qantas, the history of the airline was that it was in public ownership. It was a national carrier. And as a result, it had very strong relationships with the unions, the transport unions, the baggage handlers. All those people had a big stake in Qantas. So he broke that dominance of Qantas work practices to unions. They outsourced a lot of the maintenance. He picked a big fight with the pilots and grounded the airline instead of keeping it flying, because he didn't want to give in to them. During COVID, they took $2.7 billion in government payouts, in government subsidies, while they sacked 1,700 workers, largely baggage handlers. And this is while Joyce's own remuneration package increased by to $24 million in the latter part of the last decade. So that was fairly controversial. And also, there was a lot of anger about the way that he used the airline for his own personal purposes. For example, he was a very openly gay man, and Qantas was very strong in promoting the same-sex marriage referendum in 2017, and that resulted in him getting a lemon meringue pie in the face from a protester in 2018. So a lot of controversy surrounding Alan Joyce.
What do you think his legacy will be?
Well, the report talked about Joyce as a long-standing and dominant CEO. He was rarely challenged by the board or by his senior executives. So the average tenure for a CEO at a publicly listed company in Australia is 6 years. So Joyce did 15 at Qantas. So I think there's going to be a lesson for that, for public companies, that they, even if they have a benevolent dictator in charge, that at some point it can all go south if that person is treated as a god and is let to really do what they like without being challenged or questioned. So I think there's a lesson there for other companies to look at what happened under Joyce and take some takeouts from that. So there's an argument for shorter tenures. But Joyce, in terms of Qantas, he made the company a financial success as he trashed the brand. So he resigned just after they announced a record profit last year of a net $1.7 billion. So he left Qantas in a better place financially, but it was a national icon, and it has been tarnished. Its allure has been tarnished as a result of his tenure as CEO.
Productivity improvement might be New Zealand's biggest economic challenge. So how can we fix that?
In her latest column, Bill's chief economist, Hilmari Schultz, discusses what can be done to lift New Zealand's abysmally poor productivity. She joins me now. I mean, from my memory, we've been talking about this for at least 30 years. I mean, are we ever going to crack it?
Yes, Brent. I don't think we're ever going to crack it if we only tinker around the edges. I think, 30 years ago, we all had this perception that it's the tyranny of distance that's making us unproductive. But I think once you open the hood and you look inside, there's such an array of complex issues that we need to fix. And we can fix them. We are a developing country, a developed country. We're not a developing country. And we can definitely fix these productivity issues.
How?
I think there's quite a complex array of things, but the first is to look at, productivity is either you look at labour productivity or capital productivity. And we have only had slight gains in terms of capital accumulation. So continuing our love affair with buying homes and land banking. We have had hardly any productivity gains in terms of uptake of new technology, improvement in our education system, reallocation of our resources. So I do think that we need to very clearly look at those things to be able to fix that.
What role can the government play? Where can it intervene, if you like, to help lift productivity? I mean, for instance, if you talk about investment in housing, does that come down to sort of tax, how we tax it? And of course, just reintroduced, the interest deductibility for investors.
I think it is, but it's also addressing our housing shortage first and foremost, by addressing also being able to free up some of our infrastructure to make it easy in terms of when you develop a new area, to make it easier to be able to build a house, to make it more affordable. So I do think the government could play quite a significant role in making sure that we have access to these things, and they can use the tax system to make it a bit easier on New Zealanders.
Are too many of us working in the wrong jobs? I mean, in the sense that we're working in jobs that are relatively low income and relatively low productivity, rather than having more people working in IT and those sort of new tech, high-tech sectors.
Absolutely. The issue we do have is that we are a commodity-driven economy, and a lot of those commodity-driven sectors are low-tech or low-productive, especially the tourism sector. So I do think it will also mean that the government needs to significantly step up the investment in research and development and incentivising ICT and new technology to develop and to invest in New Zealand.
So it's not about ignoring, say, tourism or agriculture, but it is about putting a renewed focus on those other sectors, is it?
Absolutely, but also what do we do in tourism and agriculture that we can actually use higher skills? What are we doing in terms of biotechnology, of all the innovative things that we can do? We are a leader in terms of agriculture. So what are we doing to make sure that we sell the IP part of agriculture, not only the commodities?
And when you talk about R&D, I mean, does that mean greater tax credits, government sort of subsidy? What? How do they get businesses? And I guess I want to turn this around a bit, because we always do talk about government, but what about the responsibility for businesses to actually do more?
Absolutely. But the issue we have is the majority of our businesses are SMEs. So when you look at other OECD economies, they have some big boys and some big businesses that spend a significant proportion in R&D that has a direct and indirect and induced impact. So we are slightly in a difficult position that the majority of our R&D is actually government focused, because they can afford it, where the R&D coming from our SMEs need to be incentivised.
But do we need more larger businesses? And is that kind of Kiwi psyche of everyone wanting to be their boss? So we have these multitude of small businesses, a builder goes out on his or her own and they run their own little company, just them, maybe an apprentice, and that's it. When we need actually them to join together with others to create larger businesses that give you those economies of scale and productivity gains?
Absolutely, and maybe not even joining up the businesses, but sort of an agglomeration of the willing to look at things collectively, to look at R&D, to look at new technology. So if some of the sectors do that collectively, then SMEs can use a small proportion of their revenue to inject into R&D.
I'm not sure if I'll be here in 30 years' time, but will we be still speaking about this then?
I have a suspicion we still will be speaking about this then, because if you look at the portfolio of our exports over the last 100 years, it hasn't changed. So I don't think there's enough incentive for us to change in the next 30 years.
That is all for this week. We appreciate you watching. Remember, for business news you can use, nbr.co.nz.